A few months after God of War 2 came out in early 2007, and before Chains of Olympus came to the PSP in 2008, the series saw its first spin-off and third release with God of War Betrayal on none other than the Java phone of all things. All of the press's Java game reviews, which apparently was a thing back then, lauded it as one of the best mobile games ever made, and as far as hype goes for mobile games, it was certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest release on the platform at the time. So the question becomes, why is it so special, and is it worth playing? Before jumping right into it, I want to thank a guy named Nathan Leland for responding to my emails about this game. He's listed in the credits here as the art director, and he gracefully provided a lot of fascinating insight into the development and background of Betrayal. I'll be referencing our emails quite a bit throughout, so again, a big thank you to Nathan. Betrayal takes place between the first two God of War games. Ghost of Sparta on the PSP also takes place between the first two God of War games, and it's unsure if that happens before or after this. What's also unsure is if this is canon or not. It's never been officially dismissed, but it basically hasn't been officially acknowledged either since release, and fans generally agree that it's probably non-canon at this point, which I guess isn't surprising considering how obscure it is. Anyway, Betrayal sees Kratos side-scrolling his way through Greece before running into a mysterious character named the Assassin, who he chases through Greece before a final boss named Syrinx is sent by Zeus to stop him. It's a simple story that's mostly told through text between levels, but interestingly, it was developed in close collaboration with members of the original team at the Santa Monica studio, with the series director and creator David Jaffe and producer Shannon Studstill having the most involvement. The game was primarily developed at Sony Online Entertainment LA, which was created sort of under the radar as what Leland described in our emails as a scrappy little studio of just 4 people that was conceptualized to create downloadable and browser-based games based on Sony Pictures IPs. Think like really simple, basic sort of late 90s, early 2000s online stuff for IPs like Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy and Spider-Man. Eventually, the SOE LA studio grew to almost 80 people as they worked on a bunch of different projects, and thanks to the connection with Sony, they were granted the opportunity to work on God of War. Development started late in God of War 2's production cycle and was slated to be developed in a 6-month time frame. Now, as you've likely noticed already, this is essentially a side-scrolling 16-bit version of God of War. Though the story may be stripped back for obvious reasons, that's not to say that this doesn't feel like a God of War game, because in a lot of ways it absolutely does. Weapon-wise, the Blades of Athena return alongside the Blade of Artemis from the first game, and when it comes to magic, the Medusa's Gaze and Army of Hades abilities also return from the original game. The orbs you collect effectively work the same way you level up the damage for your weapons and abilities, and you can even find the Gorgon Eyes and Phoenix Feathers to up your health and magic levels. According to my emails, the producer and director Philip Cohen was a big God of War guy, and series creator David Jaffe, along with being the ideas man, was really big on translating God of War down to mobile and making sure it maintained the same energy and vibe that the series was known for. And something the series was really known for at the time was its gore, so that all had to be here. All the pixely blood splats and unattaching of limbs that you need can be found in God of War Betrayal, and as I'm sure you've noticed, the visuals and animation are exceptional for the platform. If you're not familiar with what a typical J2ME game looks like, they're typically way more basic than this, especially animation-wise. Even when looking at some of the J2ME games that I've looked at on this channel, which are usually on the better side visually, they still don't really come close to this in a lot of ways. The animation is just so smooth, and there's a decent amount of enemy sprites that are all fully animated too, which I guess isn't surprising because alongside SOE LA, developer WayForward helped support the project, who you might know as the Shantae developer. They're famous for both great visuals and animation, and pushing game hardware to its limits, which Betrayal does. I assume their involvement was thanks to Philip Cohen, who came from WayForward before this. But there was actually another developer involved here in a much more impactful way. About 70 kilometers south of central LA in Irvine, there was a studio called Java Grounds, who, as you may have guessed from their name, were a Java mobile-based dev who were known in the industry for their powerful development tools and porting abilities. While they did develop a lot of games themselves, developers would often contract their games out to Java Grounds to port the games across heaps of different mobile devices with different screen sizes. But along with the porting for Betrayal, which Java Grounds did a lot of, I mean, just like look at this version, Sony got Java Grounds to actually work on the game. Where SOE focused on the creative side like the writing, visuals, and level design, Java Grounds focused on putting together the gameplay and combat systems and extended their framework to support such a big J2ME game. And the scope of the game blew out the development period from 6 months to 9 months, which was just an absurdly long time for a mobile game back then. So with all that out of the way, how does God of War Betrayal actually play? Well, you have just one attack button, you can cycle between the two weapons and the two magic abilities with another button, and you can move left, right, and jump. The single attack button goes a decent way though. Like, remember, simultaneous button presses don't really fly on the platform, so they couldn't combine it with directions, so what they did was have the two weapons act as opposites, with the blades being a long-range, low-damage weapon and the sword being short-range, high damage. You just mash the attack button to repeat the same basic combo, and if you're jumping, it modifies the attack. What's most amazing and most impressive about this combat system is that it feels really punchy. Like, each hit just lands really well, and again, it's because of the fantastic animation. I know I sound like a broken record with this, but the way enemies react to your hits is just fantastic, and it goes a really long way here. The combat is also broken up by another God of War trope with the quick time events. When enemies are about to die, you can start a QTE finisher if you want, and they look great. And with the humanoid goons, you can pick them up and throw them into other enemies, which is just really fantastic. So you go through each level beating up enemies with some light platforming and light puzzling mixed in, as you'd expect from God of War. The platforming is serviceable with a handy double jump though. Due to the nature of J2ME lacking multiple inputs, you can't press a direction button and jump at the same time, so a single press of the jump button launches you up at a 45-degree angle, which frankly is a bit weird, and the infrequent puzzles mostly involve dragging things around and pulling levers to open doors, as you'd expect from God of War. You'll also come across gates that won't open until you kill a certain number of respawning enemies, as you'd expect from God of War. It's all pretty standard God of War-y stuff, and it doesn't really surprise you from start to finish. Unfortunately though, the more you play, the more it starts to fall apart. The combat is just too simple, and there's no point really upgrading both weapons as you go, let alone the magic abilities. Like, both weapons are viable, though the blades are more fun due to their range, but for any playthrough, you'll only want to invest in upgrading one weapon because that's the most efficient way of doing things. It's also one of those games where most of the time enemies will stay dead when you respawn, so dying doesn't hold enough of a consequence for it to be intense. This is typical for J2ME games though, like actually resetting a room like that, especially when they have checkpoints, is often too computationally expensive to do. Though enemies react really nicely to being hit, Kratos doesn't react at all to being hit. Like, there's not even a blood effect, so often you can not even realize that you're taking any damage. There's also problems with the hit rego, and activating the quick time events is a little finicky because you have to get really close to enemies to start them, and there's no visual confirmation to tell you that you're in range or not, so they can be risky to even try. And then there's the magic abilities, which are a total pain to use because you need to cycle your way to them, and then after every single cast, it reverts back to your weapon and you have to cycle your way to them again. Because of this, magic is just too slow and it just leaves you too vulnerable, and on top of that, it's super unsatisfying to use because the enemies barely react to it, though it is pretty cool that you can freeze them mid-animation with Medusa's gaze. What ends up happening is you stick to spamming attack with whatever weapon you chose to upgrade. You probably chose the blades for the range because really doing anything else is just too unreliable, and this gets really tiring as the game goes on. The enemy types do evolve as you go through, but you defeat them all essentially in the same way, by just spamming attack. So while the combat system feels quite good for what it is, it suffers from being boring, which it really shouldn't do for a game that's only about an hour long. There is a bonus arena mode that you can fight your way through, but there's just not a lot of incentive to do so with this combat system. One pillar from God of War that doesn't really translate is the boss battles. There's effectively only two bosses in total. There's Argos, which is a repeating mini-boss of sorts that looks cool but is just defeated like any other enemy, just sort of takes longer. It's also interesting that they fully modeled Argos for God of War 3, but he was cut from that game, so this is his only appearance in the franchise. It's kind of interesting. Then there's the final boss, Serix, which tries to mix things up by spawning enemies and having these magic abilities, but ultimately it just isn't enough. So on balance, is it worth checking out God of War Betrayal, especially if you're a God of War fan? Well, you're not really missing any lore, especially as it's doubtful that this is even canon. The assassin character has some speculation about who they are, with a lot of people thinking that it's Hermes, and interestingly, this was the only enemy character in the series that lived after encountering Kratos, but otherwise there's just not a lot really going on here. The combat is a little too simple to be worth seeing for yourself, so really I wouldn't say this is worth playing unless you want to see how impressive it is. And it is very impressive. Like, despite everything, this is massive by J2ME standards, and it's easily the best J2ME game that we've looked at on the channel. Reading old interviews and comments from the developers and emailing Nathan Leland was really insightful for me. Like, Nathan goes into the scope of the game and how it was just crazy for what it was. He mentions that at one point they were working 12 to 15 hour days for months on end, which is just some like whacked out CD Projekt Red Rockstar tier stuff, and the amount of effort and love that went into this is huge, and The amount of tricks and workarounds to get it going on all these devices is just nuts. Think like using palette shifting to change the color scheme while reusing assets and creating each frame of each animation pixel by pixel multiple times to optimize the assets for each device. The absolute cramming that went into this has given me a newfound appreciation for these games and these devs. I found a reply from director Philip Cohen to a negative blog post about the game from 2011, and he has a wonderful rant about this, and he sums up the game quite nicely on a note that I'd like to end on. We are spoiled by our more recent mobile tech. It's a tricky balancing act. Have background music or just sound effects. Can't have both. The combat was intentionally dumbed down due to the nature of the platform. 4 directional buttons and an attack button is all we really had to work with, and the design philosophy at that time for the mobile industry is not to overwhelmingly challenge the player who is just looking to kill a minute or two while waiting on something more important to do outside of the game. And God forbid someone tries to emulate the S40 phone version of the game we were forced to make. Try cramming the entire God of War experience into 60K of memory on a device that is basically an Apple II computer. In the end, I think the game ended up being an entertaining time waster, but for sure it doesn't live up to modern expectations. Grab a time machine and go back to when it was released, and you'd probably have a different opinion. And with that, we conclude our look at God of War Betrayal. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a lot of ways to do so. You can just simply like and subscribe and hit the bell if you really want to. You can find me on Twitter, and you can find me on Patreon. And this is the point where I thank all my patrons, so I'd like to thank all my patrons. I'd like to thank all the patrons on the screen, and I'd especially like to thank Adam Beals, Analog Man, Caden the Dingo, Dad, Devin Grandal, Dominic Chikoki, Dump Truck Parked in My Driveway, Evil Chicken, Homer821, Labcat, Lucas Racevic, Magnus Ikomo Stavik, Matthias Bayes, Maximilian Kunzman, May Aris Mizaki, Minime's Disproportionately Sized Areolas, Mrs. Minime, Peaceful Kumquat, Renegade, Review Disney Planes, Steel Kristenberry, Tommy Carver Chaplin, Trixie Emerson, Writing on Games, and Zindictive. I appreciate all your support, I appreciate everyone who's still watching, and I'll see you all next time.